Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Patricia Mota, President and CEO for the Hispanic Alliance for Career Enhancement. And thank you for joining us on today's conversation regarding the role of corporate America in addressing racial injustices. And so this is from leaders in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space that graciously accepted our invitation, and partners of HACE to join us in this dialogue today. With the recent racial injustices coming to light, they've always been there, but just this really come to the forefront, and the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately affecting our Black and Brown communities. We want to have a conversation in terms of what is the role of corporate America, and we want to hear in terms of level setting so that we are clear. I mean, this conversation is very, very broad, can go all over the place, but for purposes of today's conversation, we asked to hear from the personal experiences from the leaders that are joining us, as they each represent our community, our Black and Brown community. We're asking their perspective in terms of what's working, what can be done when it comes to the corporations and the efforts in moving towards a more inclusive workforce. And thirdly, their advice from their perspective, their experience in terms of what can be done, not only for corporations, but for us as individual employees within these corporations. I was raised in East Chicago, Indiana, which predominantly is a Black and Latino community. And my initial awareness of some of the injustices that we face as a community didn't come to light until I moved to another high school, to a more higher income, mostly white community, where my eyes became a little more aware in terms of some of the injustices. Not only are inequities happen because of color of our skin, but also structural that affect our education system, hiring practices, healthcare. And I would even say that given our topic today, diverse and inclusive representation at the top and across these big organizations. So let's talk about this. Today, our speakers are Cedric Thurman, Senior Vice President, Chief Diversity Officer at Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago. We have Manika Turnbull, who will be joining us if she has not joined us yet shortly, Divisional Senior Vice President at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, Montana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And Talita Erickson Ramos, who is General Counsel for the Americas and CEO of Casa Barilla Restaurants at Barilla Group. She also serves as an asset board member and as a former Chief Diversity Officer there at Barilla. So welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining us today. I'd ask, since I did do a formal introduction in terms of your title, I wanted to start in asking, Cedric, we'll start with you first in terms of why are you in this space of work that takes a lot of courage, especially in this day and age?
So welcome, everybody. Thank you for having me today, Patricia. Happy to be a part of the panel. And so my foray, or my reason for being in a diversity and inclusion space really comes from my high school training. I went to Catholic seminary for high school, and I've always felt like I wanted to make the world a better place, to change the world. And so that's really why I'm in the space. I feel like I want to make a difference in what I do. I've never wanted to be in corporate for the sake of making money, just for the sake of making money or helping others make money. That just sort of wasn't my motivation. It was like, how can I make a difference? How can I know what I do every day made somebody's life better? And I think that literally stems from going to a seminary and realizing you can make a difference in the world. How do you do it?
Thank you, Cedric. Talita, I'll toss the same question to you. Why are you in this space?
Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining. Having conversations is the beginning of fixing things. So yeah, I'm originally from Brazil, and I think one of the reasons I care very much about diversity and inclusion is because of my personal experiences. I come from a very diverse family, so to me, a lot of these issues are not abstract. So my godfather is gay, and to me, a gay person not being able to get married is not an abstract issue. The other aspect of the diversity in my family is that I come from a biracial family. I may not look like it, but my grandma's Black, and she actually got married twice. First to my white grandfather, who I never met, but the grandfather I actually know is a Black man. So I have my Black uncles, my Black cousins. But from her first marriage, she had two very, fair-skinned kids. And that's how I ended up looking the way I look. So to me, when I graduated from law school and I told my grandma, I'm giving you as a gift, go to the mall and buy a dress for my graduation party. And she said, I can't go to the mall alone because people don't treat me well at the mall. So to me, this hurts, and it's not abstract, it's serious. And so that's why I care. I've always, no matter what role I had in an organization, whether it was CDO or not, I feel that every leader in a company has a role to play in D&I, and it's personal.
Thank you, Talita. Do we have Manika on the line? I think she can hear us, but. Okay. So, we're talking, thank you for sharing your own personal experiences. And before we get into your perspectives in corporate America's role and the actions that are and ought to be taken, let's check in individually. I mean, you each represent communities that have been affected. Cedric, from you as a Black American male, can you tell us your personal experience, journey with the recent public racial injustices against Black communities?
Sure. So as a Black man, I tell people it's a daily occurrence. I mean, it's, P&G has an ad they do where it's now called The Look. You get the stares wherever you go. You get I'm on vacation with my wife and my son. He's playing the pool with other kids, and all of a sudden somebody realizes they're playing with Black kids. So somebody comes to their kid. You go through that, and then your son wants to know, well, what's wrong with me? Nothing's wrong with you. So I've been through all those things. I've been stopped by cops multiple times. I've had family members stopped by cops and pull out a car multiple times. And so it's a common occurrence every single day. And so while some people are reacting to the current environment, this is not a current environment. This is daily, I'm 56 years old. I've been dealing with this for feels like all of my life. One specific example I'll give though, and this is on current, about Ahmaud Arbery, who was in Atlanta and got stopped out jogging. And Patricia, I used to run quite a bit. I used to run 30 miles a week. Wherever I went, first thing I was packing literally was my running gear. Before I packed my clothes, I packed my running stuff because I always ran. And I remember my brother and I were talking. We realized we hadn't taken our sons to Wisconsin Dells, which in the Midwest, you sort of think is a rite of passage as a kid. So we're taking our kids to Wisconsin Dells. Like I do every morning, would get up and go run. So it's 6 in the morning. I'm heading out the door to go for a run. We had rented a townhouse because we had both families and two of my godsons with us. And I go out for a run in just sort of a little townhome community I'm in, and there's a main road. And so I leave to go out for a run, and as I'm probably 2 minutes into this run and sort of figuring out which way I'm gonna go, I hear a vehicle approaching from behind me, and I sort of move to the side, but the vehicle I could hear is coming closer and closer, and I realize they're about to hit me. And so I jump across and look, it's two guys in a pickup truck that yell, "Get out of here, you effing N-word," to me. And I'm sort of like, what did I do? I'm like, I'm just out here for a run. So I keep running, annoyed by it, but I keep running. I get a little further into my run, and then it had stormed the night before, and some guy had let his dog out in his yard, and as I'm jogging by the tree line, the dog heard me, the guy didn't see me. But all of a sudden the dog comes running. He realizes the dog is about to chase something because the guy didn't see me. But as I crossed the tree line and he could see me, he had been originally calling for the dog to come back. When he saw me when I crossed the tree line, he starts yelling at his dog, "Get him, get that effing N-word." And I'm sort of like, are you kidding me? So I picked up a tree branch and I said, if you don't call your dog, I'm gonna hit him. You don't call your dog, I'm gonna hit him. So the dog was sort of standing off, but I'm about to hit this dog, this tree branch. He calls his dog, he yells at me to get away. So now I decide it's time to turn around and go back home because I don't know the community I'm in. I know the townhouse we're staying in, but I need to get back home because clearly this is not gonna be a comfortable run. And so as I'm trying to figure out how to get back home and sort of jogging my way back home, the first time the truck almost hit me I was running with traffic. Now I decided I'm gonna run where I can see traffic. So if something happens, I know what's going on. So I'm running down the road, I see a truck coming, and it's across the road though, so I'm not thinking anything about it. And I'm realizing somewhere up here, I turn to go back to the townhouse, but I notice this truck is crossing the middle line of the road. And I'm looking like, where's this truck going? Because it's coming into oncoming traffic now because I'm not running at it. But the truck is sort of coming at me, and sure enough, this guy comes to almost hit me, and yells at me, "Get out of here, you effing N-word." And so at this stage, I'm trying to hurry up and get back to the townhouse. I get back, I'm panicked, I'm flustered. I go for runs all the time. So coming in the house tired, my wife sort of is used to seeing that. The facial expression I clearly had, she was like, "What's wrong?" I said, "People just tried to kill me." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Literally 3 people, I think, just tried to attack me at different times out there." And she was like, "This is why I don't like you running when you don't know where you are." Because if something had happened, nobody would have told me what happened to you, and nobody would have actually told me the truth. And so when Ahmaud Arbery happened and people said, "How could that happen out for a run?" I literally felt like I've lived that. I know exactly how that happens. And so it gets very personal when you realize I'm just trying to be me and do nothing. And for some reason, I offend, just my presence offends you. Because I didn't interact with any of these 3 people, but my presence, just my presence offended them. And so that's why I tell people it's a daily issue you have to deal with.
Yeah, thank you, Cedric, for being so open and sharing that personal story that is very challenging. And for you, I mean, in terms of that, that's one example, but there's so many, right, out there that we can discuss, not only for you, but for many others that they face day to day. Manika, we do have you on the line. I know we weren't able to get you on the video. Can you share in terms of adding on to, you know, what Cedric mentioned in terms of your own personal experience, but also why are you in this space of work? Why is it so important for you?
Absolutely. Thank you. First of all, Patricia, can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. So first of all, hi everyone, and I apologize for being late. I was early, but was having some issues connecting, so I apologize. In the midst of everything else, we are starting our phased return back to the office, so I am back in the office today, and our wonderful firewalls shut me out from getting onto the meeting, so I had to get creative and jump on my cell phone here. So Patricia, thank you for being patient, and to my fellow panelists, Cedric, great to hear your voice. Cedric is a dear friend, and Talita, nice to be on the line with you. And it was so important for me to make sure I was able to get on because I've been looking forward to this conversation. I've been having other conversations like this, here in the past week or so, and like to share and have this conversation and as many opportunities as we can because I think it's important. We're at a watershed moment as a country, and what's going to help us in exact true change is to keep the dialogue going, and that's what's been impressive to see. But I could share with you, Patricia, to your question, kind of my story and how recent events have really brought to light some things in the short story that I've been sharing with colleagues as this has come up. And it's an email that I sent to my entire human resources team last week. And, and I put in the communication, I didn't know George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery, but being a Black woman, and specifically when it comes to the treatment of Black men in America, I was raised by a single Black father who raised 3 kids, myself, my brother, my sister. And so I grew up literally watching my father and my brother, be mistreated, be discriminated against for no other reason but because they were Black men, as I listened to Cedric tell his story about jogging, just going out for being a person, right? Just for being a person, doing a everyday routine thing that people do, and being discriminated against and life threatened just by being a Black man. So, the events have really, struck a chord, and it's been important for me to share my story. I've even as I've, been on the career track, not so much with my current company, but just kind of navigating my career, have experienced covert and overt racism, and people that could do it because they did not feel that they felt that they could, and feel like they would not reap any repercussions, similar to what we saw with Amy Cooper, right? Kind of weaponizing, that power. But also a message I share with my team too was that part of my story growing up was that, having, those experiences and seeing that, one of the things that my father did not preach to us was hate, right? And so he did not, could have been really easy for him to do that. He did not preach hate. His story was all about, finding the light in the darkness. And he talked about there's a lot of darkness in the world. There will be more dark times, but what you need to take from this is where you can find the light in the darkness, and by finding that light and letting people in, letting all people in, right? Letting all people in, that is how change will happen, right? And so that's what I'm inspired about by what has come out of these events, is that there is light, and there are people that are no longer turning their head or saying that's someone else's problem. There are people that, like never before, have stepped into this conversation, and I'm seeing people turn words into actions, which is even more important. So, Patricia, I'll pause there, but like I said, it was just a very this time, and I've heard other people say, this feels different, and I hope that's true, and I hope the different is not just because in the immediate. I hope that the different is long-term, and we see some real changes going on systemically, because I do see a lot more people giving voice to the issue, which is critical.
All people from all walks of life, right? In different backgrounds,
right.
Which is also something that's unique during this time, right? Because we've also been hearing that it's different this time. Thank you, Manika. I mean, you talked about, I love that, shining the light in the darkness, letting all people in. And then I also want to emphasize what Cedric mentioned regarding that video from Procter and Gamble. It's really, if you have not seen it yet, you can Google it. It's called Unconscious Bias, Procter and Gamble, and it walks you through the lens of a Black male and what he experiences day to day. So it's pretty powerful. And if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage those of you who are listening in to look that up. Talita, as a former diversity officer and a constant inclusive and diversity equity advocate, and the many hats that you wear, what can you add in terms of your own personal experience during these times?
Yeah, and I want to build on Cedric's story, because I think it really made me, it reminded me about the importance of educating ourselves and educating our colleagues. So when someone in the workplace shares a story like that, you don't dismiss it. You don't try to, say, are you sure it's about race? Is actually trying to understand how people are experiencing otherness. And I think a lot of times, and I'll talk about a very specific hat I wear, which is the executive sponsor of our employee resource group for employees who are Black, African American, and Latinx. It's called Alleanza, which means alliance in Italian. And our employees, they kind of get together. And a lot of the discussions I have with them is about trying to find out the right balance in activities that you do in the workplace so you don't turn off people. And I hear this often where people say, well, but if we do Black History Month or we do Hispanic Heritage Month and we have all these serious things, people are not going to come because they don't want to have, uncomfortable conversations. They don't want to have, things that are not fun. So with the ERGs, I think we tried to do a lot of work with them to say, okay, we can have a fun event with an outstanding speaker who will talk about something that is, very business-like and not difficult or whatever. But you need to have the serious ones too, because if you don't find the balance between that, you're not really playing your role as an ERG, and I'm not playing a role as the executive sponsor of the ERG on educating leaders and managers in this company to act the right way. And I'll share a quick story. So back in 2016, when we had Pulse, we had Trayvon Martin, we had all these horrible things happening in a very short time period. And I talked to the ERG leaders at that time, and we were talking about, should we send a message every time something happens? And we discussed about what is the right approach for the ERG to be communicating and expressing condolences, or, and they, at that time, we said, let's send a message and say, there's just too many. There's too many things happening too often for us to try to discuss each one of them. What we need to do is have a serious discussion. This was 2016, about systemic racism. So we did a book club with a book by Michelle Alexander that talked about, from slavery to mass incarceration and all the systemic issues that you have in the criminal justice system. The following year, we did a viewing of 13th, the documentary that talks about a similar topic, but a little more easy to digest because it's visual as a documentary. And we did it 3 sessions, so each session ½ hour, and then we had a discussion. And I think those are important things. You can't wait until something bad happens to start having these conversations, and equipping your leaders to have these conversations. Because again, the most terrifying thing to me is to have someone who's representing my company hear a story like Cedric, just shared with us, and having the wrong response.
Yeah,
that cannot happen.
Thank you, Talita. And just so that you guys know, we're getting some positive feedback on the chat, and thank yous for sharing your stories. We're striking a lot of chords with the audience that's listening today, and appreciative for this conversation, right? It's just a conversation, and there's so much more that we can discuss and go deeper on. Thank you for sharing your personal stories, and this definitely has been an emotional roller coaster, to say the least, for all of us. And as top, executives and leaders in your own right, it's very empowering to hear you share your stories, and that's relatable to our audience. So let's shift specifically to your corporations in terms of all the shifts that are going on during this time. How are we tuning in, listening, empowering, checking in on our Black colleagues, employees, friends, and particularly during this time? Cedric, I'll start with you. I was happy to see, I saw a good friend as well, Matt Feldman, the CEO at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, post a 3-page letter on LinkedIn, and really was a positive response and feedback for him to really not only state that, but we know, and I know with you being there, that you guys are really doing a lot of work behind this. So how did your company address and pivot during these times and support your employees?
We're still addressing, we're still pivoting, candidly. And means well, I'll start. People always say leadership starts at the top. So the specific reason, candidly, I'm at the Federal Home Bank of Chicago is Matt, candidly. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He is a very different leader. And anybody who does this work, Talita's done it, Manika's doing it, if you don't have a strong leader, this gets really hard. I was talking to my son about this last night. I said, the work I do is like pushing a boulder up the hill, but sometimes you feel like they make the hill steeper and they make the boulder heavier. And so Matt, as a partner, makes the work I do a lot easier to do, not easy, easier, because he leads from his heart and he understands the issues. And so Matt, like you said, issued a letter at our all-employee meeting, which is why I need to drop early, and I'll explain that in a second. He opened the meeting with a very impassioned letter around his personal experience and why he said we can't sit around idly by and feel like that, this will go away or it'll pass. And he talked a lot about the nation and his history with systemic racism. So that was Matt's message. Our Chief Operating Officer, Michael Erickson, closed the meeting with some very personal remarks as well. I have been asked to help create a plan for what we can do as an organization going forward. One of the things I said to Michael over the weekend, though, is I said, Michael, if I create the plan, you've asked the Black man to come tell you all what to do. I said, if we're dealing with systemic issues, we need a systemic solution. We as an executive team are going to develop the solutions, not me as the Black man on the team are going to develop the solutions, because you all need to have shared ownership in whatever we come up with. And he agreed. And so as an executive team, we've all agreed, which is part of the message I'm going to share on our all-employee meeting when I'm done. We have a number of things we had already been doing as an organization in terms of training around unconscious bias, around microaggressions, around identity, around dominance and oppression that we were trying to get our employees to understand. So there was a lot of work that's already in place. We are also going to be, for the second part of the year, going into a lot more training and education around it. Last week, I issued some talking points about how do you have a conversation around race so people understand how to go into it, so you don't personalize things that have to happen. You listen to stories and you empathize with people and don't try to say, well, what did you do or why did that happen? Do you really think that was the issue? That's not the way you have the conversations. So there's a lot of things we're doing, but there's a lot more we need to be doing. And some of it is, as Manika said earlier, this does feel differently. So there's one thing I would say to people, it will actually be different if we treat it differently. If we treat it like we've always treated it, it may feel differently, but the outcome will still be the same. We need to make it different.
Yeah, shared responsibility, that's true, right? I think it's a lot of weight to just be on the diversity officer, the diversity leader within the company. Manika, I'll turn it over to you. In terms of your organization, I also saw along with yours and a lot of other companies, right, there was a message around standing in solidarity with our Black community that was on the page, the company page. What would you say that you guys are done during this time to pivot in terms of your DEI efforts?
Yeah, great question. I think, it's a lot of the things that you heard Cedric talk about as well. We had, we put kind of an initial kind of company statement out there. We'll be coming out with a follow-up that starts to, and you'll see us start to communicate these more on a regular basis about specifically, right, the actions that we're going to be taking as an organization. And I think for many organizations, it's, everyone is, figuring out how do we, as a corporate entity, how do we drive true meaningful impact with regards to these issues? And for us, we've been having a lot of conversations around this to say, our next steps, our actions need to be uniquely and deliberately us, right? So Blue Cross Blue Shield, and we're in 5 different states, and I heard you name those earlier. So what that means is, how is it unique to us? And, we want to make sure that we are having a direct impact on the issue, but how can we make that direct and deliberate impact from the place where we stand, right, in terms of being a health insurance company, in terms of being a healthcare company, and really digging into that meaningfully and differently, because we have a corporate culture, we have a purpose, we have a mission, we have objectives and how we support communities, but it's looking at that with a different lens, and that is, how do we help to eradicate some of the injustices that we see and leverage and use our platform. So I say that's the most immediate pivot that we've seen, is just how do we know the community is who we are. I mean, and I think if you all are familiar with the brand Blue Cross Blue Shield, we're in the communities, we're in all communities. We have a 90-year history of being in communities. And so it's taking that and recognizing we now have a responsibility to continue to show up in communities as we always have, but we've got to show up differently. We've got to have a different voice. We've got to, demand and expect more of ourselves, and how that shows up, and making sure that we don't let opportunities like this, being on a panel and speaking out and letting others know that we're in this, right? And so that's why I have, as much as I can, have accepted these types of invitations to have this conversation to let people know that, we also want to hear. I would guess that many people on the call may have our insurance, right? So you are members, and it's important to us, how we show up and represent the community. A really great example is we know in some of our communities with the riots and the looting that, some people, their grocery store, their local Walgreens or local 2-3 Walgreens that they would go to, were just shut down for an indefinite amount of time. Where do we, and we're talking about this right now, where do we step into that? How can we assist? And people are not getting their prescriptions. What role do we play? So I think that's the biggest pivot, is looking at our responsibility differently, and being able to show up. So those are going to be some of the things that you'll hear coming out of us. I would also say there's been kind of a natural pivot, which has been great for me to see internally, that some of our leaders that have stepped up and they have taken this on themselves. It has not been something that they've relied just on my diversity and inclusion team, because that's where, in the past, if there were anything like this, any inklings of these things that have come up, it was, let's just go to the Center for Diversity and Inclusion and, ask them to do something and ask them to deliver messages. We've had leaders that have come up and have really taken on themselves to say, no, this is my responsibility. And not that leaders weren't responsible before, but again, going back to it just feels different. I think people internalize it because I think they know that their employees are looking to them, right, in this time. And what are you going to do? Again, I go back to, this is a watershed moment, and this is a time for leaders to truly be leaders and be there for their employees, and not as a point in time, but for ongoing, right? So I'm watching our leaders react to that as well. So I think those are really the two main things, Patricia, if I could kind of, put a fine point on that. It's really how we are responding publicly and how we are going to change how we operate and invest in the community, and then just our leaders really coming out and really owning their role as a leader.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I think it definitely one is how our organization's responding publicly, but then the internal actions and then the work that's being done in the community. So thank you for sharing those examples. When it comes to the work, that ASA is doing, and specifically in the corporate space, and we can, when I ask my question later on, is also looking at, right, biases within hiring practices when it comes to promotions, when it comes to executive leadership and board representation. Right. So we see a lot of that going on, and I mean, that's a whole nother session, but definitely, as we get towards the end, would love to touch on and hear a little more in terms of what you guys are doing or will envision seeing companies as advice to do. So Talita, I'll hand it over to you in terms of anything you want to add on, but specifically advice that you have for employees that within these organizations that are seeking to take a stand, to be courageous and really engage in these types of conversations.
Yeah, and I will take a step back and say, as individuals, do everything you can. If you want to march, if you want to post on social media, if you want to donate, do whatever you can in your, in your personal, engage in discussions with your racist family members, do something about it as an individual. As employees, I think there's it's a little more complicated because you need to figure out how to influence an organization, how to influence leaders. And I think the best advice I can give in terms of influencing people in a broader organization is come with data. I know that everybody's feeling like, you want to do something, you want your organization to do something, but you need to, in a professional setting, try to figure out what makes sense and why you should be acting in certain ways, and come with suggestions that are backed up by, this is the right thing to do, not just everybody's doing. Because I think that there's been some pretty well-documented backlash against organizations that have never done anything, and then now they just come out and they're doing virtue signaling, or they're showing this level of wokeness that is very, it just doesn't feel authentic. And I think the organization that I think has been praised extensively, and I think is basically the only one that probably didn't get any backlash, was Ben & Jerry. And they had a very strong statement, but that statement came as an evolution of 10 plus years of doing work in the space. They had ice cream that was called Pecan Resist. Their founders were arrested in protest. They have been very active in the space. So when they come and say something as strong as they did, which was an excellent statement, it feels authentic, and it feels like they're not just doing this to react to the circumstances. I think everybody needs to do something. And again, as an employee, come with data, come with suggestions, and try to influence the people who are on your side. So again, the executive sponsors of your employee resource groups are definitely someone you can leverage for that. If you're lucky to have, again, a CEO who's very engaged, go all the way to the CEO, make suggestions, and everybody's trying to find the right thing to do here. And I'll add one last thing in terms of resources, because, I think there was a bunch of questions here about how to engage in these types of conversations. So we are doing on Friday what we call a Day of Understanding, and we're using a framework that was provided by an organization called CEO in Action. So if you Google CEO in Action, you will find again, hundreds of CEOs who made a pledge, who made a commitment, a specific commitment about doing something on the D&I space. And they have a bunch of resources, and one of them is exactly like engaging in these conversations. And they have a framework, and they call it RICH, which is how to talk about race, identity, culture, and heritage. So how do you go and when you engage with someone and telling a story or talking, how do you identify, are we talking about race? Are we talking about identity, about culture, about heritage? How can I learn? Is a framework for learning. So you understand, what is my identity, what is my heritage, what is my race, and then I can see how other people are different and learn. So it's just one resource, and I'll look. I cannot tell if it's gonna work or not, but we have over 100 people registered for that for Friday, so we're looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's all about. Thank you for sharing that, because it's having the conversations, right, and having the platform and the forum to be able to not only hear and listen, but to have folks share what they're going through and what they've gone through during this time. So before we ask for each of you for a piece of advice, and then we'll open it up for questions that we have on the forum, does anybody want to add on specifically to the point when it comes to some of the structural racism or biases that happen when it comes to hiring or even promoting individuals within organizations in general?
Well, I think the key is if everybody's going to be honest about what's going on, I think now where we sit today is, Manika said, this feels differently. You know, people have been doing bias training for years.
Right.
But you still, if you look at the data, there's bias in the hiring process of a lot of organizations. And so the question is, what actually works? And I think what happened was what has been happening, a lot of people are doing things and comfortable checking the box, but not comfortable looking at the outcomes. Because in diversity inclusion space, and I'm trying to remember who I heard say this, one of the things they find interesting about D&I, people always saying we're trying to get there, we're trying to get better. Companies don't try at things, they succeed at things. And for some reason, relative to D&I, we're quite comfortable trying, but not as comfortable making sure there's success in place. Whether that means adding additional people resources, dollar resources, or setting the right metrics. But the standard by which things are acceptable in D&I is a good effort as opposed to an actual outcome. Because if you set the hard metrics in place, like in every other part of the business, it'd be real simple that you see things look different, whether that is board representation, whether that is dollar spend and supplier diversity, whether it's employee representation, whether you see in talent pipelines, whether it's community engagement, however you want to set the measures for your organization that's appropriate for your organization. You can do the hard things, but for some reason, that's not where people want to go. But that's why I said earlier, Manika said this feels differently. If we treat it differently, it will be different.
Right, right. And I know you have to jump off soon because you got to address some of your colleagues. Any advice that you have for the employees that are seeking to take action within their own, that you want to add on from what Talita mentioned?
I think Talita said it best. Do something. Don't sit, like, one of the interesting things, why this time exists today is people, there's a quote I saw I thought was great. It says, you know, hate and racism are taught, but so is indifference and apathy. And so we can look at our peers and our colleagues and say they've been apathetic, they've been indifferent, really haven't engaged in this conversation. Well, now's the time to make sure, if there was ever a time to make sure you spoke up, now's the time to make sure you speak up. You cannot sit back and let this moment pass and not be open and honest and candid about what needs to be done, because heaven forbid we need someone else to die under certain tragic circumstances for people to decide, well, we got to have this conversation again. I was watching something last night. Oprah's doing this 2-night special around this whole issue. And one of the people said, I'm tired of having this conversation. He said, I've had it all my life. My parents had it all their lives. Their grandparents had all their lives. At what point do we stop having this conversation? And so right now, I would say, there's something to do. Whatever you think you need to do, as the leader said, do it. Don't question it. Don't second guess yourself. Do it. Because your being involved and engaged may be the spark plug to get somebody else on the other side to say, you know what, I think differently about this now. So,
thank you, Cedric.
So, and I apologize, I do have to jump now because we have our all employee session now. And so as Manika said, I'm addressing all of our employees on our all employee call in 15 minutes. And so I need to jump to dial into that call to make sure I get my remarks there. So, but thank you all. And if anybody has questions, Patricia knows where to find me.
Absolutely. Manika, I'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, so similar to what Cedric and Talita said, I would say my advice is seize this moment. This is your time, right? You know, being in the DEI space, you know, we've always, as professionals, have always talked about, hey, I want that moment, I want that opportunity to really, you know, talk about this and get people to listen. The time is now. You know, we have the floor and people are listening, right? And so it's about getting organized, being clear about, you know, what support that you need if you're an ERG, BRG leader, and laying out a plan. And that's one of the things that we did here. I have a team. I manage a lot of different things here in HR, but diversity and inclusion is one of my responsibilities. And so immediately, the weekend when the protests were really taking off, sent a note to my team. I said that, we need to get a roadmap together. We need to hit the ground running with our roadmap for the organization on, working with our corporate communication partners a series of communications that, you know, we want to hear from our CEO, that communications that I should be pushing out there, resources. We have a lot of different resources here at HCSC because we have an established DEI team here. So how do we get resources back on the forefront? How do we leverage our BRGs? We've got 9 BRGs who are very active, very passionate. How do we leverage them, get them going, get them engaged, give them, you know, some autonomy to do some new and different things. So, you know, activate our Executive Diversity and Inclusion Council, which is, you know, we've always had that, but again, talk about the pivot, you know, asking them to do new and different things in that role. It's no longer gets to be kind of this nice, for show role. Not saying that it's been that, but again, we need them to exercise some different muscles. So put together a roadmap. We'll be rolling it out actually this afternoon with a launch communication of what we're going to be doing. We did a session, so this year, every year we have a mandatory DEI learning, what we call a learning solution, and so this year it's around the topic of emotional tax. And Patricia, happy to share those resources later with you. And we did this earlier in the year before, you know, all of this unrest happened, and it just so happened that topic is so related and to everything that's going on. And so, you know, we're, you know, leveraging that to say, if you've not taken that, make sure you go out and take that. So, but it's generally just a roadmap of everything. So going back to the question, the advice for these ERG, BRG leaders, it's, you know, getting organized, understanding what do you have at your disposal, and adding value, right? Identify where you can add your best value as a leader and among your ERG members, and be very, forward in what you need from leadership within your organization.
Absolutely, courage, right? Talita, anything you want to add in terms of resources, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, and maybe what I would do is I'll talk about one very specific thing, because I think when Cedric and Manika were talking about how can we do better, or how can we succeed and not just keep trying. Mm-hmm. And we did have an advisor on our diversity and inclusion board, an external advisor, and she gave us this this explanation to our entire HR team about the difference between having quotas and having targets. And she said that, you know, most people have like this visceral reaction when we talk about setting quotas, because historically they can be arbitrary or not grounded in reality. But when you talk about having targets, it's more about understanding the context and understanding what should be doable. So I'll give you an example. If you're recruiting in Chicago, you can know that, you know, you say that the talent pool in Chicago will be X% Black. So you should be able to recruit at that level. It's not the same in Atlanta. It's not the same in Des Moines, Iowa. And that's okay. But you should have a number, and you can say we should be able to recruit as the average of the population. Or you can say, okay, maybe you're in financial services, or you're in technology and you have a pipeline issue, which you can always address as well, engaging in that area. But it may be that you say, okay, so let me look at other financial service institutions. Let me look at other technology companies. If they can do X, I should be able to meet or exceed X. Mm-hmm. So it's having like very realistic targets, and try to educate leaders on the difference between having targets so you can measure success versus having quotas, which again, most people are just gonna they're gonna stop listening as soon as you start talking about that. But I think right now, is very important. If your organization is not doing that, if they don't have targets for recruiting, developing, for getting people into leadership, they need to start looking into that.
Thank you, Talita. And so I'll jump it over. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them through. I'm looking at a few right now. So Manika or Talita, whoever wants to take this, is how can, what advice for young professionals on building a safer and more collective culture in the workplace for our Black colleagues?
Manika, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I could take that. So I think, it really just starts, at the basics, right, of, relationship building, right? And I think it's getting to know, I think if you get to know people and who they are, right? And, you know, if when things come up that you might be in a situation where someone is, you know, saying something or behaving a certain way, or, you know, something just doesn't feel right, where you can have influence in being able to, you know, be a supporter, you know, of those colleagues. And I hope I'm answering the question, but what I interpreted that question as saying, you know, I'm a young professional. I have, you know, Black and brown colleagues. How can I be a supporter of them? And so I hope I'm interpreting that the right way. And I do think that is, you know, that is how I would approach it, right? If you're new to the organization, I think it's important because, right, you also have, there's some risk and there's some vulnerability if you're new and you're young in your career. So I think part of it is, you know, building relationships, building influence, being able to make sure that you are positioning yourself to where you feel that you can confidently be that supporter and, you know, be a voice in the room, whereas maybe your Black and brown colleague may not be in a position to be a voice in the room and help support from that position. So again, I hope my interpretation of the question is correct. That's where kind of my feedback comes from, but please let me know if that was not the right interpretation.
Talita, did you want to add anything?
I do, and I'll build on that. I think what Manika is talking about is the difference between being a bystander and being an upstander. So how can you, when you witness something that is wrong, report it? And if something happens to you, report it. If something happens to someone else and you witness, report it. Because again, now I'm wearing my lawyer hat. In my experience, when you report and companies do something about it, that sends the best possible message to the rest of the workforce about what behavior is accepted and not accepted. And if you don't give your organization a chance to address issues, you know, all these things are going to go unresolved, and the environment will be less safe because people will feel like they can say insensitive things or they can make a racist joke. You know, and it's not okay, and it makes people feel unsafe. So report it. Report it if it happens to you. Report it if you see with someone else.
Thank you. How can companies and their employees push for meaningful and lasting change, knowing that corporate budgets are tight?
I can try to go first, and I'll quote Cedric, even though he left. It's this whole idea of you know, if you're serious about D&I, then D&I is not a perk. D&I is not a nice to have. D&I should be part of your business, and if it's part of your business, you should have metrics. You should know that it needs to be what success looks like, and you need to put your, you know, money behind it. And if I'm very skeptical of companies that are cutting their D&I budgets at this time, because I think that is signaling that they were not serious about it in the first place. So in short, I don't think the budget should be tight. I think companies that are serious about it should be putting the resources to accomplish what they define as success. So if something is broken in this process, it's not just the amount.
Manika?
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly, you know, and it does, it sounds so cliche, but it starts at the top, and I mean very top, right? Even with the board. And so, you know, if you don't know, you should ask the question, you know, is diversity and inclusion part of the board agenda, right? And meaning, you know, does the board get updates on this? How is the board holding, you know, the senior leadership team holding the organization accountable for these things? You know, I could tell you, you know, I present to our board, you know, on a regular basis. Diversity and inclusion is part of the board charter. It is required that there is a diversity and inclusion update, that there are targets, there are certain things in place. So similar to what Cedric was saying, what gets measured gets done. And when you have your board looking at it, and our board is, they don't give lip service. They look, they ask questions. I mean, I get drilled in those board meetings, and so I think it's, you know, that is a question. I'm not sure what organizations are represented on this call from the participants, but you know, to me that's a question to ask, right? Because I think that, you know, shows, you know, how committed is the organization, and how committed is you know, how interested are, you know, at the very top of the house, how interested are they in ensuring these things change? And I would assume more boards are going to be starting to ask this of their senior leaders if they're not already, right? What are those metrics? So again, that's some of that things feel a little bit different, and this is where I think some organizations will pivot. But I think that's, first and foremost, it has to be there, because if it is not part of something that the board is looking at, and the board's job is to help guide and direct the organization, and that is an important piece.
Mm-hmm. Excellent points. I think that part of it is also, as you mentioned, Manika, right from the board level. And we've seen a lot of that, at least on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, where folks are holding these corporations, their organizations accountable in terms of leadership as well, and the representation on the leadership ranks as well. So it does feel different in that sense. Like, I don't think I've seen that much, at least engagement around that at this level. Can you talk, and I think we've mentioned a few resources, but if you have anything to add on regarding specific talking points around how to have a conversation around race. I think that's a great question. I think folks that perhaps did not speak up just because they didn't know exactly what to say, right? Or they're not sure of what to say. So if you have any advice in terms of what are some key talking points?
Yeah, and Patricia, it might be, I'm happy to share some resources with you. You could post on your site, because I think I think it will vary, right? I do. I think if you're a people leader, it varies. If you're an individual contributor, it'll vary. If you're, a peer. But I think first and foremost, it's just creating the space to have the dialogue. And I think, again, no matter if you fall into those categories or not, it's about creating the space. It's about, just being open to hearing other people and receiving. And there's no wrong answer, right? And so when someone is allowing themselves to be vulnerable and share about their experiences, you have to let people ask questions. You have to let people express themselves. And even if, their experience is different than yours, or you just don't understand it, that's okay. Ask that question, right? It's seek to understand, right? And so I think there's so much that can be done by just asking questions and listening, and asking questions and listening and sharing. And I think that's where race gets really hard, where people just shut themselves down from hearing because it is not their lived experience. And sometimes people just cannot believe that someone has been through something, right? Because that it's so far beyond what they know. And so it's about just, being there, being present, and hearing the conversation. But to me, that's where it starts. And that's what, what we're seeing in the organization today, and, people reaching out. So, and I think that's probably the most powerful thing that I've seen, that people just reaching out and asking a question of their Black and brown colleagues and just saying, can you just help me understand? Or, I've not experienced this, and I likely will never experience this, but I want to understand. And to me, that goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, our own perceptions are based off of our own individual experiences, right? And I love the question, and it's a question that I've used quite a bit as a people leader and throughout my career is, help me understand, or help me understand your viewpoint or your perception on this, as a tool to help break down barriers and create really, great conversations of understanding and bridges of understanding. Talita, anything you want to add?
Just one thing, and is building on this idea of like having situational awareness. So understanding that conversations will be different depending on your audience, who you're engaging, where you are. And it's great. I'm looking forward to looking at your resources, Manika. And I think the one thing that I've experienced with a lot of people is the fear of saying something wrong, or the fear of saying something offensive. So a lot of people don't want to engage because they're so afraid they're going to say something, that is going to be considered offensive. So a lot of times, again, going back to understanding the situation, some people that I have engaged separately outside the office, I said, let's go grab a coffee across the street and have a conversation, because they may not be ready to have a conversation in public. And you compare that to some of the discussions we have within our employee resource group, where again, they have been through a lot of education. They are very aware of things. So it's a very different dynamic. And I think some people need that individual kind of a more private conversation because they're so afraid.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I know we have a lot more questions that, running out of time. Manika, as soon as we get that information, we'll be sure to include it for everyone that's joining us today. If you, on any of the channels that you're tuning in here today, have any resources that you would like to share or any other questions that you'd like to address, please put them on the comment section for LinkedIn or Facebook. We'll be sure to share the links with our speakers here as well. And I want to really give my thanks to Cedric, to Manika, and to Talita for taking the time, for being courageous in these conversations, because I really truly believe that it will take each of us to truly move towards building a more inclusive workforce, building a more inclusive society. And it takes each of us. And we have to build up the courage to have these conversations and to ask the questions, right? And I saw a quote this morning by John Maxwell, and it says, "The courage door has only one knob, and it's on your side." Let's open up the door, guys, and continue the conversations. Thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing, Patricia. Bye.